Well, it is a great pleasure to be with you in this blue-green spaceship that we are inhabiting. I told my wife that I was coming to Washington to speak to a few thousand Catholics, and she said, "Well, what if they find out that you're a Methodist?" And I said, "How would they find out? I don't know." I said I thought it would be okay, because I think that my work's very rooted in this precise place as this Ignatian family. Listening to these stories of Father Curry and of Bob Holstein has been really moving to me, especially the story about how Bob Holstein spent some months in jail for his work in Georgia. The other thing my wife said to me as I was leaving, she said, "You know, of the last 10 times you've gone to Washington, D.C., you've ended up in jail 5 of them." She said, "Please don't this time." And I said, "I will do my best. I'm glad that you guys are going to Congress and not to jail on Monday. And I don't think it's your job quite yet, perhaps, to go to jail, but I do want to talk about the power and the cost of this kind of work that we do together for a better future." And I'm going to tell you a story that I hope will be of some help as you grow up into this work. It's a story that'll eventually get to a big mistake that I made in my life, but it'll take a minute to get there. My work on climate change began when I was in my 20s, and I wrote the first book about what we then called the greenhouse effect. It came out in 1989, so the same year as those murders, and it was translated into 24 languages and a bestseller all over the place. And that book is not the mistake. That book, sadly, was right. It turned out that what we understood way back then, what the scientists told us was going to happen, is precisely what has happened. It turns out there was really no great mystery about climate change, about global warming. We knew back then that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We knew that that CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. We knew the planet was going to warm up, and indeed that is what is now happening. Indeed, it's the biggest thing by far that humans have ever done. So far, we've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius, about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And it started to have all the effects that we knew it would have 30 years ago. Already we see huge changes in creation. Up in the Arctic, about half the summer sea ice in the Arctic's already melted. Those pictures that came back from outer space in the 1960s, those first pictures of the Earth floating in the sort of blue-white marble floating in the black void of space, those beautiful pictures are as out of date as my high school yearbook picture, because there's some, well, come to think of it, actually, it's almost exactly the opposite. There's a lot less white up top now on the planet. The seas have begun to rise, and we've begun even to discombobulate the planet's hydrological cycle, the way that water moves about the Earth. That's what we're seeing. If you wanted one fact to kind of understand your century, you could do worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's simple physics, and that's why in arid areas, California, say, we see big increases in evaporation, and then drought, and then forest fire. Right now, this week in the Pacific Northwest, people are being told they should stay indoors because there's too much wildfire smoke in their cities. And once that water has gone up into the atmosphere, it's going to come down. And it comes down hard in deluges like we've never seen before. Right now, in Pakistan, people are enduring the greatest flood since Noah. There are 33 million people out of their homes. That's like all the population from Boston down to Baltimore displaced from their homes. It's big, and it's bad, and it's incredibly unfair. Nobody in Pakistan did much of anything to cause the crisis that we're in. There's a couple 100 million people there, but they've contributed less than 1% of the carbon that's up in the air heating the planet. The 300 million of us who live in the United States, about 4% of the world's population, have put about 25% of all that CO2 up in the air. That makes the math easy. If 1,000 people die in the floods in Pakistan, something like 250 of them are on us. And that's what happens now around the world, day after day, week after week. Since we're talking about Central America some and remembering the traumas of El Salvador and the rest of that region, remember that 2 years ago we had the biggest hurricane season in the history of the Atlantic. 30 storms. We ran out of letters in the alphabet. We got into the Greek alphabet. The last two big storms of the year, Eta and Iota, crashed into Central America. And they did extraordinary damage. The damage in Honduras was equivalent to 40% of the GDP of that country. The biggest storm we ever had, Katrina, did damage of about 1% of our GDP. So there's lots and lots and lots of people in Honduras now. A lot of people died in the storm, but a lot who can't farm anymore because their farm is covered with sand or silt, or because the bridge where they took their produce to market is washed out and it won't get rebuilt anytime soon. And so a lot of those people are headed towards our southern border. And when they get there, I can't tell you what their legal status will be, but I can tell you what their moral status is. They did not cause the problem that they're now suffering from. They release about a 15th as much carbon as an American in the course of a year. There are tens of millions of people facing starvation right now in the Horn of Africa because they're on their 5th straight rainy season without rain. In Somalia, the average person produces about 1/500th as much CO2 as the average American. So sadly, our forecast for what was going to happen and how bad it was going to be turned out just to be right. And we're still in the early stages of this. Unless we get our act together very quickly, that 1 degree is going to become 3 degrees Celsius, 5 or 6 degrees Fahrenheit in the course of your lifetime. And if we let that happen, then we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to. We'll talk about how we're going to get past that, but first we're going to talk about this mistake of mine. Because when I was in my 20s, I didn't have a very good sense of how power in this world worked. I thought that if I wrote books and other people wrote books and scientists did their work and things, if we explained this, if we won this argument, then of course our leaders would do what they needed to do to make change. And so for 10 years I just kept writing books and organizing symposiums and things, until it became pretty clear to me, much too late, that we had won the argument. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and reason and evidence. The fight was what fights are always about: money and power. And the other side in this fight, the fossil fuel industry, had enough money and hence enough political power that they could lose the argument and still win the fight. And that realization, which I hope you guys reach sooner than I did, about how power works and what you need to do to stand up to it, that spurred me to become not so much a writer anymore, but more and more and more an activist. I started with 7 college students up at Middlebury College in Vermont, where I teach, the first global movement around climate change. We called it 350.org. It takes its name from what scientists say is the most carbon you could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, a number we're already well north of, about 420 parts per million now. That's why California catches on fire. That's why the Arctic melts. That's why Pakistan drowns. People said, why you choose that weird name? And we said, because it's an important number, but because we want to organize around the world. And we figured that it'll be easier to use Arabic numerals, not English words, to get the rest of the world engaged. We had no idea what we were doing, and no one had sort of tried to do it before, so we just set to work. There were 7 students, there are 7 continents, each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet. And out we went to do our work, and the next year we organized our first big global day of action. This would have been about 2009, and it was a remarkable day. We had 5,100 demonstrations happening simultaneously in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history, not because we'd done such a great job of organizing, but because all over the world there were people who understood what the threat was and wanted to start doing something about it. People who were working in public health or in war and trying to prevent war, or people working on women's rights or development, people who understood that none of those things would be possible on a planet that was quickly overheating. It was remarkable in part because I'd always been told that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and that if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and on and on and on. But I remember sitting there that day. This was kind of before Facebook and Twitter, if it's possible to imagine the world before that, long before Insta and all of those things. And but we had our killer app was something called Flickr, this photo sharing website. So we had people all over the place uploading pictures of these demonstrations as they were happening. And my job that day was to be watching these pictures flow in and sort of sending them out to journalists and things. They were coming in 20 and 30 a minute sometimes, and it took about 10 minutes of watching them to realize that that thing about rich white people was just nonsense. Almost everybody we were working with around the world was poor or black or brown or Asian or young, because that's what almost everybody in the world is, you know. And what do you know, they were exactly as interested in the future. So once we'd sort of gotten this started, once there was a kind of movement growing, we began to assemble some of the power that we needed to take on Exxon and Chevron and Shell and BP and the other people who were dominating our politics. We didn't have the money that they did, but we had people, bodies, creativity, spirit, and so we started to work. We did big campaigns like trying to block this thing called the Keystone Pipeline, which became a kind of signal environmental battle for a decade and the first loss for big oil in their efforts to keep building stuff. And then we launched this divestment campaign to try and get institutions around the world to sell their stock in coal and oil and gas companies. And that's been remarkably successful. We're at $40 trillion now in institutions that have joined in. It's the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history. And of course, most of the work has been done by young people at colleges and universities around the world. One after another, they've forced those institutions to divest. Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and the University of California and the University of Michigan and Princeton last week, and all kinds of Catholic institutions around the world, especially Jesuit institutions, one after another, including Georgetown here close to home. Not quite everybody. Boston College, you have a little bit of work still to do in this regard, but we will keep at it. And what do you know? All this has begun to work because because the fossil fuel industry doesn't really have a leg to stand on. It's not just that people have been pointing out that they're destroying the world, it's that people have been pointing out that there's a way better way to deliver the product that they've been delivering. You know, in the last 10 years, engineers have dropped the price of renewable energy about 90%. The cheapest way to generate power on this planet now is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is Hogwarts scale magic. That is water into wine, you know. We're at the moment when human beings could, within the next decade, if we really wanted to, end our 700,000-year practice of setting things on fire. Fire's been good to people. Darwin said that fire and language were the two things that really marked human beings. Fire let us cook food at the beginning. It let us move north and south away from the equator. The anthropologists say that gathering around the campfire at night was one of the things that established the deep social bonds that mark human beings. And then came the Industrial Revolution, and learning how to set coal and gas and oil on fire produced the modern world that we know. But it comes at this enormous cost around climate change, but also an enormous cost in terms of human health. When you burn things, you put particulates in the air and people breathe them in. 9 million humans a year die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. That's 1 death in 5. And it's entirely unnecessary because the vaccine for those deaths is electric cars and air source heat pumps. It's solar panels and wind turbines and batteries. And not only is it bad for the climate, and not only is it bad for your lungs, it's bad in other ways too. When you rely on a fuel source that's only available in a few places, the people who live on top of those places get way too much power, and they abuse it time and again. That's the story of the king of Saudi Arabia. That's the story of Vladimir Putin, who took his export winnings, 60% of his export earnings come from just selling oil and gas. Look around your house and see if you can find anything made in Russia to boycott. You probably can't because they've just become a big gas station for the world. He's taken that money and used it to invade Ukraine in the most brutal way imaginable. My wonderful colleague, Svetlana Romanko, who spent the last few years as part of the global Catholic climate movement, its Ukraine leader, has this year been taken a sabbatical to work full-time on trying to deal with the invasion of her country. We've done Zoom after Zoom and webinar after webinar, and always in the background you can hear air raid sirens going off and sometimes bombs falling. And she keeps saying, remind people that fossil fuel destroys the climate and that fossil fuel produces fascism. Think about the world that we could live in if it ran on sun and wind. It's not a perfect world because you still have to mine some stuff to produce all that, but you have to mine a lot less because, well, you need lithium for a battery or a solar panel, and you've got to mine it, and we should do it well and humanely. But once you mine it, you put it in the solar panel and you leave it there for a quarter century, and it keeps producing power every time the sun rises above the horizon. If you mine coal to produce power, you set it on fire and then you have to go mine some more the next day. 40% of all the ships in the ocean are just carrying coal and gas and oil back and forth. You guys have the possibility to build an extraordinary new world. But you have to do it, we have to do it fast. This is a timed test. It's not like the other political issues that you deal with. If you're talking to a congressman on Monday about climate change, remind them that it's not like everything else that they work on. Politics moves slowly, and they're sort of used to that. As long as I've been alive, we've been deciding whether or not we should have health care for all Americans. And I think it's a sin that we haven't yet done it. And every year people die and go bankrupt. every year people die and go bankrupt because we haven't done it yet. But when we finally get around to it, it will not be harder because we delayed. Climate change isn't like that. Once we've melted the Arctic, nobody has a plan for how you freeze it back together again. So we need action, and fast. Finally, the U.S. Congress has begun to act a little bit. They finally passed a bill this summer, 34 years after the first scientists testified before Congress about this crisis. And it provides some money that we need to start building EV chargers and so on and so forth. But keep reminding them that that's only the beginning. That's only a down payment. And then realize that we can't rest just in taking on political power. We also have to take on financial power. That's why we started that divestment campaign. But now we're also working hard about the banks and other big financial institutions that provide the money that keep the fossil fuel industry going. The world scientists have said we cannot keep building new fossil fuel infrastructure. No new pipelines, no more frack wells and things, but the banks keep giving them money, and most of that money comes from the US. The four biggest American banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, are also the four biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry. They've given them $1 trillion since we signed those Paris climate accords. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage that thing. They were happy to do it themselves to try and make a little money. So we're trying to stand up to them. We've got people, we're organizing people to do things like cut up their credit cards from those places. We're going to have a big day in the spring when people all over the country are cutting up their credit cards from those banks, and some of them will be underwater on our dying coral reefs, and some of them will be up in those fire-scarred forests, and some of them will be sitting in banks and ending up in jail, and so on and so forth, because we have to send that kind of strong message. Now, let me say just a couple of things about the question of who should be doing this work. Because young people have been doing this work in really remarkable ways. I know, because as I said, I started 350.org with college students. And when we started that divestment campaign, it was young people who took it up everywhere. And when those young people graduated, they went on to form this thing called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal. That's the reason we finally got this bill in Congress, you know. And then there are people far younger than that who have taken up the fight, and in beautiful ways. You all know the name Greta Thunberg, and you should. She's one of my favorite people to work with on the planet. I adore her. She is as great up close and in person as she is from a distance. Tough and smart. She would be the first person to say, however, that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs spread around the planet. There really are. And they have 10 million followers. That's how many. 10 million is how many young people around the world were out on climate strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic kicked in. I seem to take a week now every September to write college recommendations for people who I just think of as close colleagues in this work. It just happens that they're 17 and it's time for them to go to college now, you know. So young people have done their job. I get a little worried, however, because sometimes I hear people my age, and I'm in my 60s now, say, well, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem, which seems ignoble, and it also seems impractical, because however intelligent and however idealistic and however energetic you are, you lack the structural power to do this by yourselves, okay? You need older people too. So in the last year, we've been organizing this thing called Third Act for people over 60. And I want you to tell your grandparents about it and get them engaged. Because you know what old people do? Old people vote in huge numbers. There is no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? And so we need to get them on side and working. And you know what else? Old people ended up with most of the money. Baby boomers have, in the silent generation ahead of them, have 70% of the country's financial assets. So if you want to take on Congress or you want to take on Wall Street, it's a good thing to have some older people backing you up. And that's how we've been describing our work, to be behind and following and backing up young people as they push. I just came from a big demonstration outside a bunch of banks in Brooklyn, and it was a lot of fun. There were a bunch of high school kids there, a couple of hundred, and of course they were out in the front of the march because they're somewhat sprier, you know. But at the end, there was a big crowd of people with hairlines like mine, and we had a big banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels." That's the kind of intergenerational solidarity that is required. And to return to this question, where I began about going to jail, let me tell you something that you might pass on to your teachers and your pastors and your grandparents. I organized the first big demonstration here in Washington against this Keystone Pipeline that turned into the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in this country in a very long time. 1,200 and some people went to jail. And that was enough to really get things going. But when I wrote the letter asking people to come to Washington to get arrested, I said quite specifically, I do not think that young people should have to be the cannon fodder in this case. They're doing the work, but if you're 19, it's possible an arrest record is not the very best thing for your resume. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, you know? And so it was with pleasure that I saw a lot of people who looked like me arriving for this. We did not ask people as they were getting arrested, how old are you? That would have been rude, but we did cleverly, I think, say, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts came from the Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman presidencies. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was so old that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which I'd almost forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was very good for the young people who were there to see their elders acting the way that we need elders acting in a working society. So, what I want to say to you as my time runs out here is extraordinary thanks for the work that you've already begun on, and at an early age. It's really important that you do it. It's really important that you don't be fooled the way I was, and that you understand where power lies and that you have to take it on. And it's really important that you remind people older than you that they have a real responsibility here too. You're the ones who are going to have to live in this world that we're creating, but none of us want to leave behind a legacy of the kind we're now threatening to do. This is the most important thing that's ever happened on this planet, and we do not know how the story is going to come out. We do not know who's going to win this fight. The only thing I will tell you is that as you engage in it, you have brothers and sisters in every corner of the earth, and they are grateful for the work that you are doing as you are grateful for theirs. That kind of solidarity goes an awful long ways. Thank you all very much.